Hello and welcome to Westwind, an audio podcast about cancer, technology in medicine, and policy issues. I'm host and medical oncologist Dr. Jack West from the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. You can find Westwind material at BeaconMedIC, one word.com, at iTunes, or just about anywhere you get podcast content. I would just ask that you show your interest and support by subscribing, commenting, sharing by telling friends and colleagues in person and on social media, and rating it however you feel is appropriate. You can also share your ideas and opinions by emailing us at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. I'm very happy to be joined today by Dr. Nate Pennell, who is Associate Professor of Medicine at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine of Case Western Reserve University, and part of the Department of Hematology and Medical Oncology at Taussig Cancer Institute at the Cleveland Clinic Foundation in Cleveland. So thank you very much for joining, Nate.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to be a part of this awesome podcast.
Great. So we've known each other longer than a decade, but what I think is really gratifying about this podcast, there's several aspects, but one is that I get to delve into a little more of the history of the people who I've known, but maybe haven't known as much of the personal side of them as you can learn. And a lot of people give me feedback that they really enjoy getting a window into people beyond the podium view of them, even if they're known in the cancer world. So let's start with your childhood. You were born in Pennsylvania. I know you grew up a Pittsburgh Steelers fan, so there must be, an interesting aspect to living in Cleveland now. Can you tell us a bit about your childhood, your parents, and whether growing up you or they had expected you to go into medicine?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was born near Pittsburgh in a town called Latrobe, which was Arnold Palmer's hometown and home of Mr. Rogers as well. So lots of famous things for a tiny town in Western Pennsylvania. But it is also home to the Steelers football training camp. And so it's diehard Steelers country. I did leave Pennsylvania when I was 7 years old, and there was quite a diaspora of Pittsburgh natives moving out as the Rust Belt was sort of moving away from steel mills and whatnot, and people sort of spread out around the country. And Steelers fans spread out everywhere, including Florida, which is where I moved, and was in St. Petersburg from ages 7 through 14. And then moved to Fort Lauderdale for high school, which is sort of still where I consider home. I then went to North Carolina, UNC, Chapel Hill for my undergraduate college. So I feel like each part of my life goes along with a sports affiliation. So I've always kept my Steelers affiliation. My college basketball affiliation comes from my undergrad years in UNC.
Right.
I went to grad school at University of Florida and med school, and so I'm sort of a college football gator.
Yep. It's interesting, because I was wondering why, though, with you just having your younger childhood in Pittsburgh, if you imprinted on them like you did, and you aren't a Miami fan?
Well, I moved to the Tampa Bay, St. Petersburg area, and the Bucs were really a laughing stock at the time. You think the Browns are pitiful now. That was the Bucs back in the late 70s and 80s when I was there. And so people tended to keep their sports affiliation. And my mom was a huge Steelers fan and used to tell stories about sitting on Terry Bradshaw's lap while she was a waitress in training camp. And, it's just something that you tend to keep from an early age.
And that's cool. So how'd you like Chapel Hill and UNC when you were there?
Oh, I love it. That's still probably, to me, one of my favorite parts of the world is the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area in North Carolina. I have a personal dream of retiring there one day, maybe. But I never really appreciated basketball until I went to college there. And then it's just in the blood of everyone there.
They do seem to take it a little seriously, yeah.
Just a little bit, yes. And UNC is having a down year this year, but we'll be bouncing back next year, I'm sure.
Now, when you went to medical school, you also pursued a PhD. That was in Gainesville at University of Florida, correct?
Yeah, I like to call this the long and expensive MD PhD. So I actually did not plan to go to medical school. I went to graduate school for neuroscience and got my PhD. And while I was getting my PhD, I was working with rheumatologists. I was working with neurosurgeons, looking at fetal tissue transplantation. And my particular project was looking at antigen presentation in the brain and mechanisms for allograft rejection in rats and mice. And I really thought that going to medical school would send me into a career in neurosurgery or rheumatology. And I ended up not liking any of those things and going a completely different way.
You know, it's interesting. There's quite a few folks who came by oncology by way of neuroscience. And I was somebody as well who had at various points looked into doing a PhD and certainly was focused on neuroscience until really deciding I didn't enjoy it clinically as much as I'd have hoped, and then finding a place in oncology. When did you decide that oncology was the pivot you wanted to make?
Well, I think part of it was doing rotations in neurology and in neurosurgery and really discovering that as cool as the brain was from a research perspective, I didn't really feel like I could intervene in the way I wanted to clinically in those patients. Whereas at the same time, there was one of the most fabulous mentors to all of our medical students was an oncologist at the University of Florida. I'll give a shout out to Jay Lynch, who is still at the University of Florida, Shands. And a lot of people went into oncology just because he made it sound so exciting and dynamic. And that was really capped off by a rotation I did in my third year of medical school on the oncology service. And it was immediately evident that the relationship you built with the patients was completely different from any other service I'd been on. It was really something. I think some people hated it, but some people were immediately drawn to it, and I was one of those people.
You know, it's interesting. I had gone to Brigham and Women's Hospital for internship and residency, and I know you did as well, and then went on to a Dana-Farber fellowship. One of the things that I remember thinking and talking to my colleagues about was how the inpatient side of oncology is really not representative of the broader range of what oncology is. What's your thoughts on that? Because I really do think that they are very different worlds, and a lot of people who love the general practice of oncology are really more focused on the outpatient side, or at least that there's very different worlds of inpatient and outpatient.
Oh, I agree, especially in solid tumor oncology. It's a completely different job. I think if anyone had to do inpatient solid tumor oncology as a full-time job, they would just go completely insane and choose a different career. I tell my residents who work with me on the inpatient service, you know, if you're going to go into oncology, you need to make sure that you are doing an outpatient rotation. So you can really see, you know, our patients are normal people who are coming in, they're dressed normally, they're living their lives, they're playing with their kids, they're working at their jobs, and everything is just like any other outpatient medicine specialty until, you know, things get more serious and occasionally they end up in the hospital. But what you can get out of an inpatient rotation is the feeling of whether you bond with patients who are coming in, and it's, you know, it's the scariest and toughest portion perhaps of their lives up to that point. And if you really enjoy that level of connection with the patients, then maybe oncology is something you should think about. There's lots of opportunities to talk about goals of care, about end-of-life issues, and these are things that are important skills for lots of different types of medicine, but are especially relevant in oncology.
Yeah, what I liked about oncology was that it involved all of the different organ systems, and that it had a lot of the breadth of primary care, but it was higher stakes. I really like that part. You know, it's interesting. You had lived so much of your life in Florida and North Carolina, then you're in Boston. Mm-hmm. How was that adjustment, both culturally and weather-wise? I mean, just lifestyle, I think must have been pretty different between Gainesville and Boston.
Yeah, I remember thinking as I was deciding on residency choices that, boy, I've been in Florida an awfully long time, and I want to go somewhere completely different, somewhere I'd never been before. And of the choices when I was going through my chair about different medicine programs, ones that were affiliated with good fellowship programs in oncology, which is what I thought I wanted to do, Boston just seemed like a natural choice. And so I interviewed around a number of different places, including out on the West Coast. And it really connected with me. And, you went to the Brigham and you remember that they just have sort of a different feel of the people there and the culture, and it really resonated with me. And the truth is, I just wanted to go to a city and live a different kind of lifestyle for a while. And I loved Boston. I could still live there today if I was given the choice. But I will admit that I have never adjusted to the cold. To this day, having lived in Cleveland for 12 years and 6 years in Boston before that, I really hate cold weather and snow.
I don't know. Do you appreciate the irony there? That it's like, well, I don't know, Manitoba maybe after this. I don't know.
I know. I think I keep moving farther and farther north each time. I'm not sure if that will continue.
Well, I think there's a cancer center in the Arctic Circle that could be looking for you. But I first met you just as you were leaving Boston and starting at the Cleveland Clinic. So that's a while ago. But at that time, we were talking about having you start helping out with GRACE, Global Resource for Advancing Cancer Education, which was something I was doing as a means of providing free cancer information to patients and caregivers around the world. And you just got it. And I remember having a great conversation with you at an ASCO. And after that, you really helped out a lot and continued to be involved with GRACE activities over the entire time since then. And I really get a sense that communication with the lay public has always been a big part of what you do. You've written for Newsweek and do a lot of communication. Can you talk about whether that was a deliberate process or whether that has been a more accidental channel you've gone into? But I really think it's something that you have a particular talent in.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I think it's really interesting. I also want to credit you and GRACE really for giving me a voice very early in my career. And I think that actually has taken me to a lot of places and opportunities I wouldn't have had if I hadn't had that. So I want to thank you for that. I believe we met at a dinner at ASCO probably in 2008 or 2009.
Yeah.
And, at that time, I had been very engaged in internet bulletin boards. I don't know if the listeners even remember what that is anymore. So I had a little bit of experience with talking and answering questions and doing things online at that point. But when you described what you were putting together, where patients and their caregivers could write in and actually directly access doctors to ask questions about lung cancer, and it was an opportunity for us to be able to talk about what was exciting going on in the field. And I just thought that was just the coolest thing. And I hadn't seen anything like it anywhere else. And it really was a surprise opportunity. I don't think I'd ever really thought about writing really about lung cancer before then. As for being able to speak to a lay audience, I don't know. I feel like that's just sort of my style. I grew up a very blue collar working class family. And even though I've gone to some fancy named places for some of my training, I've always felt kind of like a blue collar guy and like to be able to describe complicated issues to just about anyone and not necessarily just to the medical community.
You've also been one of the earlier people who saw the value of Twitter and have engaged in a lot of conversations. You and I have had some debates and also just shared new information with each other and learned from the community. Can you talk about some of the greatest values that you see in Twitter, both past and present?
I think the initial appeal of Twitter was simply as another kind of news resource. I'm sort of a news junkie and I subscribe to a bunch of different newspapers. I used to read Newsweek all the time when it was, one of the only ways to get a weekly updates on the pre-cable news era. And I discovered that, and this is still true, by the way, that you can go on and follow reporters, you can follow your favorite sports teams, you can follow people whose opinions you care about, authors you like, and get a tremendous amount of information available on sort of a real-time basis. And it's an incredible resource for that. But it was later that I discovered that you could do the same thing professionally. You could actually follow people whose opinions you respect in your field, or journals that are putting out papers. And people have already judged what is of value and start talking about it. So you don't have to dig through all of the journals yourself, right, and see what the most exciting and important research is out there. And it's clearly going to come up if you have a wide enough network. And then finally, the value of Twitter that came out years later was that you could start actually having a voice yourself. And if you were tied into the network of patients and docs and scientists, you could start weighing in on topics. Again, very early in my career, before anyone really knew who I was or what I was doing, you could weigh in on topics and papers, and people would actually say, that's actually a pretty good point that this Pennell guy has. And you could start making a bit of a reputation for yourself in the social media world. And I think that is still very true, even as it's expanding quite a bit and more people are getting involved. You can still have a voice. And very early on, where before it was very hard to meet and talk to luminaries in our field. And now, if I want to have a conversation with, say, David Gandera, why it's actually relatively easy to engage him in an online conversation about a paper that's coming out, which is, I have to admit, is pretty cool.
It is. And I think the fact is that it eliminates several of those potential barriers, one of which was the kind of professional ones of you at a point in your career that might be earlier than a David Gandera, but also geographically, that people can connect with each other all around the world. And we're having discussions now that include our colleagues in Asia and Europe and all over, where previously there were extremely limited opportunities to interact in any semblance of a direct way with people on another continent.
It really shrinks the world. It brings the entire community. I'm sure this is true for other fields as well, but in the lung cancer community, and if some new drug comes out and it's really interesting or it's approved by the FDA, and I'm curious to see if this is going to be of use, say, in the European community, I could just say, hey, what do you think of this? And before you know it, 3 or 4 top doctors in Spain or France or Italy are able to weigh in on that. And it's really, I think we've almost gotten kind of blasé about how extraordinary that kind of network is, and anyone can tap into that. All you have to do is follow these people, and you can talk with them. You can learn what they have to say, and it makes the lung cancer community feel much smaller and closer together.
What do you think of the debate about whether there should be more physicians on Instagram and even TikTok, these other social media platforms where there haven't been as many physicians, but there's certainly a lot of folks from the lay public. And, the argument might be, it's not as easy for us to converse with each other there, but there's arguably a responsibility to share information and counter some of the misinformation or disinformation that is being put out. For instance, are we making it harder for ourselves in challenging what's promoted in the anti-vaccine movement because we're not in these places where there are more folks in the lay public, but just not physician voices out there to counter it?
I think depending on the different social media platform that you're talking about, it's really, who is the audience you're trying to speak to. So if you want to talk professionally doc to doc, then Twitter is definitely where you need to be, because that's where the richest network of physicians is. And so for me, that's where I focus most of my time. But if you want to talk about educating people about, say, tobacco cessation or the dangers of vaping or lung cancer screening, then you need to be on one of these other things. So Facebook, I would say, is probably the biggest area to be if you want to reach the largest group of patients, for example, with lung cancer, and there's large online communities of patients there. If you want to talk about the dangers of vaping to teenagers, then I think you need to be on Instagram and now TikTok, because you can potentially reach a large audience for that. But it all depends on what you're trying to do. I wouldn't certainly tailor the same message that I might about a new trial that came out that I want to sort of educate the medical community about to someone on Instagram or TikTok, because I don't think it would actually reach the people who would care the most about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. Let's also talk about how Twitter has changed ASCO. And you and I were among the earlier adopters and talking a lot with each other and a few dozen other lung cancer folks who were on Twitter years ago during the ASCO meeting and debating the significance of the presentations essentially in real time. Mm-hmm. It exploded in the last couple of years. Has that been, in your mind, an unmitigated good, or has it changed the feel? Because I think it's harder to follow conversations now when it is such a large conversation. I don't know that it is worse, but it's just fundamentally different to me than it used to be back in 2013.
Oh, I agree with you. It's completely changed. I don't think it's necessarily bad, although I do worry a little bit about, when things become very large. So if you just want to follow, for example, the hashtags ASCO 20 and lung cancer social media, and you want to try to get your ASCO feed from that, it would just be overwhelming. There's just too many people talking about things now, whereas before you could just see, it was me and you and a handful of other people, and you could kind of be at the meeting and see what people were caring about from that. Now, you can still do that, but you have to, I think, be a little more selective in who you're following. You have to really set a filter to get the content that you want now. So you have to be a little more cautious.
Now, you'd mentioned while you're at the meeting, I think one of the big potential changes that we're facing now is the threat of not having these larger meetings, at least not in 2020. And of course, ASCO has always, to their credit, been at the forefront of virtual meeting support in terms of the access to the slides and the presentations, mm-hmm. which is great. But of course, there's so much that goes on at the meetings, the investigator meetings, the opportunities to talk with folks from various companies with novel agents, connecting with colleagues. What are your thoughts about what we're facing in 2020? Is it going to be possible to have this meeting without it being a real threat, to have subclinical cases of COVID-19 there and spreading among tens of thousands of oncologists who go back home to their clinics and their families? And I think this is a kind of unprecedented challenge in the oncology community this year for AACR and then ASCO coming up.
Yeah, well, I'm not going to pretend to be an infectious disease expert, but I would agree with you that if ASCO's annual meeting was being held, right now or next month, that you'd have to give serious consideration to delaying it or maybe skipping a year, because, what better way of worsening an outbreak than to bring, tens of thousands of people from all over the world, put them all in close proximity to one another, and then send them all right back home again. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. But the flip side of that is, the question is, could you get the same kind of impact out of a meeting like ASCO or AACR virtually without actually having it in place? And I would say yes and no. So if the main goal of the meeting is to disseminate the most practice-changing research, you can get that virtually. You can do that now. So I do that on social media just for, say, ESMO or World Lung in another country where I can't attend the meeting. You can follow people. You can get the results of the phase 3 trials. You can see the things that are really influencing treatment pretty well. But what you miss is the orders of magnitude of other stuff that isn't immediately practice changing, but is still incredibly important. And you could never really I think, wrap your head around that level of, just the poster session, wandering through the posters, talking to people, being able to actually ask questions and dig into really interesting things that maybe 5 years from now are going to influence treatment. You can't get that, I think, virtually. And the other thing that, of course, you just can't substitute is the opportunity to actually meet and talk to people in person, which is such a fabulous benefit of these. If we hadn't had Inpatient ASCO in 2008 or 2009, you and I never would have met and gone on to become luminaries in social media that we are today.
Exactly. Well, I think it's really interesting because you and I have talked about this on Twitter in the last just week because things have been changing so quickly, and we really need to think about having more robust real-time virtual education options, including streaming the content. And you had said, gee, once we have this, is the genie ever going to go back in the bottle, or is this going to be the way things are in the future? But I think it's interesting. I find myself thinking, well, you can buy the music from the Rolling Stones, but it's not the same thing as going to the concerts. It hasn't replaced that experience, nor do the folks at the Super Bowl think, why did I come here? I could have just watched this on TV. So you can really distinguish between the exchange of the information and all of the other ancillary experiences that are part of it. But of course, it's complex, and there are many concerns that people have. The cost is very high, the just practical challenges, the carbon footprint. So I think there's just a lot of factors. And I do wonder whether in the wake of the COVID-19 outbreak and infections and all of the concerns we have now, even I hope once things get back to a more of a sense of normalcy, will this change things irreversibly so that it really turbocharges our remote learning options? I mean, even with my own son was sent home, he's in Seattle, and so there's more of a threat there, and he's going to be doing more remote learning over the next couple of months rather than in the classroom.
Yeah, it's a good question. We just found out today that we've got our first cases of the COVID-19 here in Ohio. And, that's just because we've started testing for the first time. So I'm sure that that's going to continue. I hope that it doesn't completely do away with in-person meetings, big in-person meetings. But I think this is a great opportunity to talk about how to strengthen the virtual options so that people can attend without having to do it in place. And maybe it isn't necessary for 30,000 people to attend a meeting, but perhaps a smaller number of, the hardcore people can attend and absorb all the details. And then a lot of other people who aren't necessarily needing that level of exposure could get it virtually. The other thing is, I'm not sure that we necessarily need, dozens and dozens of huge multi-thousand people meetings happening every 2 months staggered throughout the year. Maybe we could get by with a few big meetings and fewer of them.
Yeah, so this might kind of cull the litter a bit in terms of it being a little excessive in having so many live meetings going on right now.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, social media, this has been my theory for a while, that social media has really democratized meetings and research. And now everyone is presenting their research at whatever their most recent meeting is because they know it's going to get out everywhere. People are going to see, even at, a small ISLAC meeting in Latin America or a small sub-study, of ESMO in a sub-meeting of ESMO in Europe, you can present a major trial and it's going to immediately be disseminated. But at the same time, maybe that means we don't need to have these giant meetings quite as often because you can now put your research out at any time.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's turn to the issue of molecular testing and execution. You published a paper in JCO Precision Oncology last year that was looking at modeling of costs of molecular testing in the setting of advanced non-small cell lung cancer that illustrated savings for broader next-generation sequencing compared to individual tests such as in sequence. Now, advanced non-small cell has a growing number of targets all the time, and I would say that this argument of broad testing is only even more compelling now than when you initially presented this. But what's your view about NGS testing and the clear utility of it outside of lung cancer, such as in CMS. CMS has provided support for NGS testing with any advanced cancer, but we don't have as much data for that. So what are your thoughts about the concept of NGS for just about any advanced cancer?
So you know that I'm a huge proponent of broad testing, or at least broader panel testing for lung cancer patients. But the truth is, the reason I'm a big proponent of that is that we have real, findable, actionable targets that once you get them, you can treat a patient and change their lives by identifying that target, and at a relatively significant rate and percentage of patients have these targets that we can find them. Once you leave lung cancer, I mean, there certainly are other diseases that have actionable targets, but many of them already have standard of care testing in place. So when you start looking for extremely rare targets, say NTRK, for example, should we be testing everyone with every type of cancer upfront for that? Certainly if you find it, you can change the life of that person. But when it's only present at, 0.1 to 0.3% of patients, is it worth testing every patient with a relatively expensive technology? I'm not sure at the cost that it takes now to do that, not to mention the cost to the patient of getting their tissue and the biopsies and waiting and whatnot, that really would hash out as being kind of the best value for our healthcare dollars right now. So it's a little bit hard because it's a little bit outside my field. I'm such a subspecialist in lung cancer that I don't want to go beyond my knowledge base. But outside of lung cancer, I'm still not sure it's the best use of our money to test everybody.
And even within lung cancer, one of the more humbling things that we've seen from some of the real world evidence out there is that executing on what is found hasn't been as consistent as we'd like to see. There were data from the Singhal paper in JAMA last year that was looking at Flatiron Health data and Foundation Medicine that showed that a third of the patients who had an EGFR mutation or ALK rearrangement never got their targeted therapy ever, not just first. And then there have been data presented at ASCO last year from Florida that essentially showed the same thing, that we're falling short even when testing is done, not to mention that testing isn't done as well as it should be. And my concern is that we have issues beyond just the bottleneck or the concerns of cost, but actually the turnaround time is an issue, and recognizing what results are critical to act on that I think we need to shore up before we can maximize our ability to act on what we already know or should know.
Yeah, I mean, this is something you and I did an education session at ASCO last year on this topic. And when you really dig down into the numbers of how we're doing on testing on very standard, widely accepted markers like EGFR testing and ALK testing and guideline directed testing for things like ROS1 and BRAF, which now everyone is supposed to be tested for with non-squamous, non-small cell lung cancer. And even in the United States, testing is very suboptimal for these. And that doesn't even get to the timing of it. How quickly are they getting those? Are they getting those results in time to actually give initial treatment to someone? Or are they already moved on to giving chemotherapy and immunotherapy before they get those results? I think we should spend some of the resources we're spending developing new fourth generation tyrosine kinase inhibitors and companion diagnostics into expanding the already existing testing that we know can change people's lives and making it available to everyone, making sure every patient can have their tissue tested and accurately assessed in a very short period of time so that we can apply this to everyone. In fact, we did another modeling study looking at this, and I won't leak the data because we're hoping to see what if we get a presentation at ASCO. But very interesting to look at the numbers of people that are tested and diagnosed with these actionable driver oncogenes and how that might influence, the cost to a healthcare system of applying this broadly to everyone, and how that relates to how many life years might be saved by identifying and treating all these people that right now may be going on to live their lives and die of cancer without ever finding that they have a very actionable mutation.
Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. I look forward to learning more about that. I hope that it's presented at ASCO. I hope that ASCO happens.
Yes, me too.
I usually end these discussions just saying, well, I look forward to seeing you at ASCO. And, it's not been as uncertain as now. So at least I'll be able to see you on Twitter, but I hope to see you at a live meeting soon and chat personally as we continue this discussion. But Nate, thanks so much for taking the time. These are, obviously really timely issues to be dealing with. And I think it's just really exciting to be navigating these waters with you together, both over the last 10, 12 years since we started chatting about this and how much things have changed and how they're poised to continue to change in the coming years. So it's been great working with you on this.
Well, and I just want to thank you for some of the opportunities that I've had by working with you and through Grace, and even through podcasts like this. I think you have done a fabulous job of bringing the small world of lung cancer and expanding that out to not just other people in our field, but to patients and their families and the greater world, so that they can understand some of the incredible things that have gone on in the last decade. I think in order for the world to know what we're doing so that they can support that and apply it, we have to be able to get that message out. And I think what you're doing is helping that a lot.
Well, thanks so much. I'll look forward to seeing you in one place or another soon.
Yes, I'm sure we will.
Thanks for listening. The West Wind Podcast is a Beacon Medical Interchange production with sound engineering and distribution by Mark Lindsay of Talking Speaker. We hope you'll be motivated to subscribe, whether at BeaconMedIC.com, through iTunes, or through another podcast service. Please also rate it, and I hope you'll be inclined to tell friends and colleagues in real life and on social media. We're always happy to get your suggestions and other input at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. Talk to you again soon.